Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today, I'm covering new Student Starfish and Clams. I'm not sure why, but I feel like both of these episodes have gotten the short end of the stick when it comes to attention. Maybe it's because they're sandwiched between two specials? I don't know, but I feel like no one really talks about them. I'll be sure to give them the appreciation, and more, that they deserve today. A big thank you to everyone who's been watching the channel lately. Y'all are great. I've been trying to leave comments on my own videos more to kind of start the conversation, and I feel like it's been working, so that's exciting. And with all that said and done, let's just get right into it. Starting off the review today is New Student Starfish, which is by all accounts an alright or decent episode. I guess I'll just begin with a spoiler and say that this isn't an episode I rewatch very often, unlike its sister. That's not to say I dislike this episode, but it's clearly nowhere near my favorites of the season, and I doubt that this is a very surprising opinion. So, New Student Starfish starts off pretty well, I'd say. I mean, come on now, we start with my fave, Gary, helping SpongeBob get ready for the day, and I really liked this fun sequence. It was quite imaginative. Also, I really like how this first part of New Student Starfish shows off SpongeBob and Patrick's best friend dynamic, which really helps to anchor the episode in their friendship. This wins the episode some points, which will become relevant later when the episode starts actually losing points. I also like that the episode shows that out of the two best friends, SpongeBob is the one with an actual life. I mean, these are staples of their characters, but I also like to see it as building on Big Pink Loser. Patrick's wait for you to come back line is really memorable to me, and many others too, if the way it's been immortalized online is any indication. And when Patrick coming to school with SpongeBob suggested, I love the enthusiasm from both about this. The picture that Patrick has in mind with the two of them is adorable and hilarious. Moving on, I like the sequence of SpongeBob showing Patrick all around boating school. There's some good gags in there, like the stairs of learning, and it's also just neat seeing these other aspects to boating school that we never see. And this scene also makes it clear that this episode is really for the people like me who love to see that child-adult balance in SpongeBob SquarePants, because this episode is playing all over that line. Though, it does kind of mess up that line later, but we'll get there. In some ways, this episode can almost be seen as referencing the importance of boating school in SpongeBob SquarePants ever being greenlit. But I've talked about that before, either in my first review or my review of boating school, so I won't go over that again here. Overall, New Student Starfish leans far into the child side of the child-adult line, especially as boating school is being portrayed pretty much exactly like a normal school in this episode. But I think that what I mentioned earlier about SpongeBob having a life and Patrick not having one is something that could be attributed to the adult side, when you think of SpongeBob also going to work being something that pulls him away from Patrick. And there is an episode that makes that exact point anyway, No Hat for Pat. At least, I'm pretty sure that's the episode that does that. I know Patrick's motivation in that episode isn't the same as it is here, but there's some similarities. New Student Starfish is one of those episodes that showcases a less pleasant side of SpongeBob. I wouldn't say I dislike him in this episode or anything, but it's simply a fact that we see him pretty smug, at least for a tiny bit. It's like Employee of the Month in that way. But unlike certain other episodes, cough cough party pooper pants, SpongeBob's smugness here is pretty well within the already defined bounds of his character. And it's fun to see that his overachieving nature has extended from work to boating school as well, with the obvious exception of his driving. He can't drive for shit, but he'll be a good student. I'd say that this is pretty consistent with what we've seen in Hall Monitor and The Bully. It's really fun to see SpongeBob and Patrick act like two kids in elementary school, laughing and joking with each other while the teacher's talking. And this joking around is, of course, the source of the famous 24-25 joke that we see plastered on birthday cakes and celebratory social media posts everywhere. It's during this scene, though, that the episode starts a decline. Patrick's introduction to the class lasts just long enough to avoid being grating, which I appreciate. However, it is during SpongeBob and Patrick's clownery that the episode begins to go downhill. You see, this is another one of those episodes where other characters are made to be very oblivious at the expense of the plot. Or in service of the plot at the expense of their characters. In this case, Mrs. Puff is the victim of this idiot Ray, just like she was in The Bully. So maybe you can see why I might be very annoyed then when Mrs. Puff confiscates the drawing that Patrick gave SpongeBob and then blames SpongeBob for it. This does lead to a funny joke, though, where Mrs. Puff looks exactly like the drawing, but that funny joke is not enough to save the general frustration of the situation. Mrs. Puff removing one of SpongeBob's good doodle stars also takes way, way too long, and for once I can't even enjoy SpongeBob's dramatics during this scene because he doesn't deserve this, and so I'm annoyed. This annoyance is only made worse when SpongeBob is forced to sit in the back of the classroom, and Patrick proceeds to show zero remorse or awareness of the situation. I will say though, SpongeBob's horror about being at the back of the classroom is pretty funny, and a good play on the teacher's pet gets detention trope. Speaking of tropes, actually, I think that's where my main issue with this episode lies. While there are reasons to like the school setting of this episode, namely all the reasons I said before about nods to production and a different environment, in general, the school setting in SpongeBob SquarePants works well when it is used correctly, and I don't think this episode does that. The whole point of the school setting is for it to be yet another balancing act between the child and adult dynamics within SpongeBob and others' character, but this episode leads almost entirely into the child aspect by the time we reach the school, and so that balance is thrown off. And this isn't exactly a writing problem, but more so a personal problem, as we all know I prefer the adult side of the line. Anyway, getting back into the episode, SpongeBob finally gets pissed off at Patrick, but I can't fully enjoy it because I'm thrown back into annoyance once again by the fact that SpongeBob receives the bulk of the punishment for Patrick's actions. I don't know where the idea that frustration equals comedy came from, but I'm gonna need it to be retired as soon as possible. I know it won't be, but I can hope. New Student Starfish picks back up when SpongeBob and Patrick start, quote-unquote fighting, and I like the bit with Mrs. Puff and the flashlight. And although I don't like that this episode pretty much makes SpongeBob a child during its entire runtime, I do find myself pretty entertained by SpongeBob and Patrick's very juvenile I hate you exchange. Things continue getting better once SpongeBob and Patrick have to work together to save Roger, the pet egg of the class, which is yet another point on the child side of the line. I also like that the episode lampshades the fact that the ending of this episode is weird by having Mrs. Puff acknowledge that she doesn't know what saving an egg has to do with boating school. The ending only gets weirder and even more of a non sequitur when Patrick proclaims that he thought this was Spanish class, and the very ending is fun too, with Roger hatching and being like, what did I miss? The oddity of this ending reminds me of Graveyard Shift, although not as charming. New Student Starfish is an alright episode. The beginning and ending of the episode are certainly the best parts for me, but the main problem is that the middle was weak, rife with frustrations all over the place. I'd say that the pacing of this episode was a strong point though, so kudos for that. But taking it all together, I'd say that this episode lands nicely in my good tier, where it comes in with a score of 7.2 out of 10. Coming up next, we've got the classic yet somehow hidden gem parody of Jaws, Clams. This is an episode that I've grown increasingly fond of over time, and I'm looking forward to talking about it because no one ever does, and that makes me sad. Talk about this episode, people! Maybe through this review, I will single-handedly turn the tides on the silence about this episode. Or maybe I'm being too self-important. Anyway, the beginning of this episode is really fun, as it jumps right into Squidward being a very relatable demonstration of what it's like to work in the service industry, as I've said time and time again. I'm very glad I don't work in food service anymore because I'm a very picky eater, and so I'd really be no help to anyone who's asking for recommendations from me. People would ask me about recommendations sometimes in my old job, but not very often at all. Also, one thing I really like about this scene is Squidward's "something stupid, I'm sure" line, because I quote that shit so much y'all have no idea. Unintentionally for the most part, but it's still a thing. Anywho, things get moving very quickly once Sandals pays for his food, and it turns out to be Mr. Krabs' 1,000,000th dollar earned. It's very in character for him to keep track of every dollar he's earned like this, especially considering what we saw in Wet Painters with his framed first dollar, or Can You Spare a Dime with his first dime. It's kind of wholesome to see Mr. Krabs celebrating in this way, even if it is quite silly. I also love the moment where he cheerfully, then angrily, tells Sandals and the rest of the customers to get the hell out of his restaurant. I also think that it's really wholesome that Mr. Krabs acknowledges that Squidward and SpongeBob have helped him with earning this money, and so he rewards them. Even if he rewards in his own way, I gotta say that this is much better than most bigger business owners out there. Does this mean that the Krusty Krab is a small business? I guess it isn't a chain, and it is a local eatery. Lots of thoughts. Also, I gotta have my art moment in here, but I love the painting of Squidward and SpongeBob when Mr. Krabs talks about how they've been such valuable crewmates. It was well done, like usual, and y'all know I can't resist some visual irony. As is a common thread in these Season 3 episodes, anticipation is built and then expectations are subverted, as it turns out that the reward is going clam fishing on a tiny boat. I suppose this is one of those moments where I need to turn my thinking brain off, because why are they going fishing when they're sea creatures themselves? Let me just leave that question unanswered and move on. I like all the mayhem and shenanigans that the trio, but mostly SpongeBob, get up to in the first few minutes on the boat. SpongeBob hooking everything with the fishing rod gives us a great mix of jokes, and it's also a source of foreshadowing, especially once Mr. Krabs tells Squidward not to bring anything he isn't prepared to lose, which is then, of course, comedically followed by SpongeBob hooking his $1,000,000 $1 and slinging it out to sea. This is where things start to get really funny, and the Jaws parody turns up to 11. I also really liked the fourth wall breaking with the music. That was hilarious and brilliant. It's like the meme of, why do I hear boss music, before that even became a meme. Maybe SpongeBob SquarePants is just as prophetic as The Simpsons. This episode also has some amazing visual gags. When the clam ends up eating Mr. Krabs' millionth dollar, every single one of Mr. Krabs' reactions is hilarious. From the initial shock, to the detailed painting of his eyes tearing up, to the faucet eyes, to my favorite, him literally falling apart over it. Y'all know I love me some good dramatics, and Mr. Krabs absolutely delivers here, to the point where even Squidward has to feel bad for him eventually. This episode is just super good visually. Like, I also really like the vibes of the boat and the crew out at sea. Lots and lots of good paintings and visual gags. I'm especially thinking of when Mr. Krabs is on watch for 3 days. I love the transition to that too. The music in this show always delivers. This last act of the episode is where things start getting really funny for me, as SpongeBob and Squidward team up to try and get off the boat because Mr. Krabs is starting to act quite concerningly. I like when these two team up, and I especially like it in this sort of dynamic, where they're teaming up against Mr. Krabs. Not that they're necessarily being antagonistic towards him, though he certainly is towards them. I like that SpongeBob's first thought about being stuck out there was for Gary, and then the quick cutaway to the snail eating the couch was hilarious. This show has more cutaway gags than I remembered, you know. Like, dang, is this Family Guy or SpongeBob? Anyway, this episode reminds me of Wet Painters and Arg. The former because of the plot with using a random dollar in an attempt to trick Mr. Krabs, and the latter because Mr. Krabs starts going off the deep end, which is extremely entertaining to watch, by the way, especially once he starts throwing out everyone's food. Like before, the visual gags continue to be an outstanding part of the episode. I love how suddenly Mr. Krabs drops their whole ass fridge into the ocean. Tensions rise between the two factions once Squidward and SpongeBob start getting for real desperate, which leads us to the near end of the episode when Mr. Krabs starts utilizing the fourth wall-breaking music to use Squidward and SpongeBob as bait for the clam. Although Mr. Krabs had been acting quite sadistic and had put Squidward and SpongeBob in danger for at least 5 minutes by this point, it's still satisfying to see him get his millionth dollar back, and shocking to see the clam eat him right after. I find it really funny how Squidward still has to get one last jab in at SpongeBob even as they're hanging above an ocean with no way down. Well, no way down, that is, until Mr. Krabs shows up again, millionth dollar in tow. I love the ending stinger of this episode too. It's one of my favorites, with the shock of Mr. Krabs being only a head and an arm, but also his laughter at the fact that he traded nothing important. It's just a humorous juxtaposition that I'm sure there was no need for me to explain like this, but I think over-explaining jokes is a part of my charm at this point, right? Clams is a really fun and enjoyable episode that, for some reason, I never fully appreciated before. I think it was just one of those episodes that I'd rewatched infrequently, probably because it was paired with new Student Starfish. I've got no problems with this episode at all. It does an amazing job at spending nearly the entire runtime at one location without being boring or even slow. Like I said before, the gags and especially the visuals in this episode are fantastic, and the fourth wall breaking really just ties everything together. I also think that this episode is a great exploration of the SpongeBob, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs dynamic. Now that I'm thinking of it, Clams is kind of like Arg and Wet Painters. Or it's like if Arg and Wet Painters had used Squidward instead of Patrick. And I think that this shows the differences in these dynamics. Anyway, this episode clearly belongs in my amazing tier, where it comes in with a score of 9.3 out of 10. As always, gonna be ending with some closing thoughts of mine, although I'm not sure if I have many. I mentioned this a couple of times already, but neither New Student Starfish or Clams were episodes I rewatched very often growing up. And even today, if I pop in my Season 3 DVD, unless I play all the episodes, it's not a high chance I'll be picking one of these episodes. Although, the odds for Clams have increased quite a bit over the years. Obviously I like Clams, but I think that both of these episodes are quite average. Like, I happen to like Clams a lot, but I don't think that there's anything inherently super special or appealing about it, and same goes to New Student Starfish. And that's me thinking about these episodes in a more objective way. I just feel like there are some episodes you kind of know are going to be more popular than others, and neither of these two episodes are it. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I'm just kind of shooting the shit here. And so I think that's my cue to end this thing now. And so I'll see y'all in the next review.